Yo, yo, what's going on?
GM.
GM, dude. What's up, Sean? What's up, Matt? The Doc T, man. I'm loving your. It's so intense. I love the mask or the whatever you want to call it, the helmet. You look great, dude.
The me. I just refer to
Yeah,
the me.
dude. Awesome. Excited to have you, Sean. What's going on, man? How's everything out in Colorado? Get a little skiing in today.
I did. Me and my two girls, Lola and Georgia, we went out this morning, and the top of the mountain was insanely good. Powder still, so we had a blast. We skied for like 4 hours straight. My legs are jello, but we're going to get in the Strawberry Park hot springs here shortly, so that should be nice. Nice talk.
Nice. Beautiful, beautiful, Matt. How are you, man? Haven't talked since this morning, but how's everything going?
Everything's going well on my end. Just hanging out. Excited to talk to Doc T.
Dude, so am I. Doc T, what's up, man? How are you? Where? If I don't know what you disclose and what you don't, so I don't know where you're calling from necessarily, but I'd love to hear what you got going on.
Well, certainly. I'm based in Germany, so we're having it's around 8 p.m. now over here, which works perfectly fine because I just left my medical office like 30 minutes ago, rushed home. Happy I made it all in time. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Dude, well, I mean, that's awesome. Number one, I want to hear, more about you or whatever you're happy to disclose. And I also think, chatting with you on this happy hour is great because on one hand, I want to know a lot more about what you're doing, especially on the blockchain. But I also just have been following your post and kind of learning more about you and your brain wrapped around a lot of the stuff we talk about. I'm interested in. So all in all, very excited to have you on. But I'm going to share my screen real fast to your page. I would love to hear more about what you're building, what you're doing, and all of that.
Sure, gladly so. So when it comes to ordinals, that's something I ventured into on the learning level pretty much a year ago. It's pretty precisely 1 year ago. I got semi-bullied into looking at the benefits of fully on-chain artwork by Brightlight or Ella, who kept talking about it in DMs. And well, I listened. I was, my personal work was more happening on the ETH side of things. Slowly building up an audience and kind of getting handed through different platforms for perhaps more featured or curated drops and collection releases over there. So just that's where I kind of built my foundations. And then I of course learned about fully on-chain work and what that actually meant. And at the beginning, it was something I took note of. I found it very interesting. But ultimately, I realized that due to the limitations that come with it, particularly in terms of file size, despite all the benefits, which are, I think, easily understandable in terms of permanence and eliminating external dependencies, something I think anyone who is venturing through the crypto space in whatever capacity is taking an interest in. I got that, but I looked at my work and I realized it's usually it was very painterly, so stylistically it's from regarding my digital art I'm more coming from the neo-expressionist direction, so very painterly, almost impasto like textures. And I realized that might just not be a very good fit for anything on chain because the file sizes by design are pretty massive. It's not generative art in that way. It's really more painterly. And with that said, that kind of stung with me because I said, well, but I still really understand that medium. So I got introduced into a group of artists who were already working fully on chain, mainly on the ETH side of things, like DID and Brightlight and Peng One, just to name a few, or Ollie, for example. And that was a compressionism group. So for any artists who likes to explore working on chain, the aspect of compressionism is something they get introduced to pretty quickly. So how can you reduce the file size of your work to actually function on chain in a way that inscribing the work is not, financial catastrophe or ends you up in distress financing or anything of the sort. And the interesting part about opening up to that kind of idea or approach for me personally was that compressionism is not just about reducing the file size of the work, but actually adapting where you want to put your work, how the file size limitations will look like from the very beginning of the artistic process. And of course, that was a challenge for me because that's something in my usual digital works, many of whom are animated and are enormous file sizes. It never crossed my mind that I really had to restrict myself there. So yeah, I looked at it and said, well, if I want to do something fully on chain, it has to be something that works fully on chain. And by that, I mean, it has to be somewhat medium specific. I don't just want to, take a JPEG or a PNG file, make it all blurry and then inscribe it on Bitcoin. That's something I really wouldn't have liked to do. So the idea of my brain on chain was born, which in a nutshell was coming from the area that I said, well, what is something, an idea, a concept that simultaneously is the most compressed version of an idea while also being the largest possible version of an idea I could possibly think of? And what I resulted doing and executing together with Vivid Gallery was to inscribe the first human brain onto the Bitcoin blockchain. And by sort of sharing the anatomical foundations of my mind, my creativity, pretty much a depiction of every past ideas, present ideas, or any possible future ideas who are, already buried somewhere in that neural network. That was something which, on the visual side of things, worked well because it chose a very, minimalistic kind of display. I used floppy disks and laser engraved 33 planes of my actual cerebrum, images I took from an MRI study of my brain from back in 2022, and decided that would be a good, visual representation of that idea.
Dude, I think I love it. So if your background, I think, obviously you're a doctor in medical practice, but were you doing a lot of artwork before and kind of segued into, blockchain specific art or inscriptions on Bitcoin? Or did like the creative process sort of start with this journey?
Well, my background right now is that OCM of mine, to be honest. That's just for this setup right here. No, my background is, professionally speaking, I'm a medical doctor. I've worked extensively in the humanitarian and transitional aid field for many, many years before returning then back to Germany. My clinical focus was on neonatology and pediatric intensive care. In terms of the public health work I was doing prior to that, of the transitional aid work and development cooperation work, was on post-conflict health system reconstruction. And while sort of working in these kind of contexts, my artistic background, I don't really have a formal artistic education. Perhaps it shows in my work, I'm not sure. It all started like, many of the stories that you hear. I was one of those teenagers who was just, roaming the streets with a couple of friends and a backpack full of spray cans. So I'm a tad older. So when I was young, Banksy and King Robo, those were kind of the idols. And we're cutting out our own stencils and trying to do something in our city, which then had its absolute climax and actually getting to work on a train at one particular instance. That's sort of how my very humble beginnings started. Then during my medical studies, I did have the chance, because university education in Germany is practically free. I did have the opportunity to study art history in parallel to my medical studies. which now actually it's quite helpful in what I'm trying to do on Bitcoin as well, because it introduced me, to early conceptual art, sort of the first pioneers and ideas that were brought there, what the whole concept behind these kind of different art movements was. I then proceeded, working abroad, where I actually, learned quite a bit about photography, primarily driven by the motivation to simply capture what was going on, perhaps to stay insane or to stay sane within this insane context. And that was something I found very, appeasing or calming in a way. So when I returned back to Germany, that was actually prior to joining the NFT space. I started, experimenting a bit with digital art forms and different programs. Then the whole AI movement started, and I played around with that. I said, well, this is quite interesting. You're somehow, finding ways to visually express what you're currently going through or thinking, or what you experience during your everyday work. That was, when I was primarily working in pediatric and neonatal intensive care. So we have a couple of things to deal with. And I always found this is a wonderful way, or a very wonderful outlet, if you like, to just balance myself back into something that is working and functioning and highly functioning, actually. So that's sort of where all of this was coming from. And I just, posted things on X, and then people took a liking in it. And back in 2021, Delta Source saw one of those pieces and asked me if we could purchase it. And I had no idea really how to, how that worked, and kindly walked me through the process there, how to list something on OpenSea and all of that. And that's sort of how it all began. And now my personal issue at the moment is that once you tap into the potential or the meaning, at least from my interpretation of fully on-chain work, particularly regarding ordinals, it's very, very difficult to go back. There are plenty of things I would love to do, I'd love to execute on. Given my quite time-consuming day job, all of this is kind of happening, on the weekend and during very short nights. But for me, the sort of gravitational force of ordinals in particular has just exceeded everything I have personally felt whatever I created beforehand. So that's pretty much where I'm at, and pretty much where I intend to stay for the years to come, because there's just too much to explore within this medium. There's a quite a long lineup of projects or collections and experimentations, if you like, that are already in the lineup. And it's a new home I've made myself here, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm astonished that the amount of awesome work you've done. I mean, I'm going to pull up your link tree here for anybody else who hasn't seen it. But expressing Bitcoin as a medium is art on Bitcoin as a medium, I think is something that's really interesting, right? Because I think at first glance, if somebody, especially from outside the space or new to the space, is looking at that movement, you're thinking, okay, essentially it's tokenizing a traditional piece of art, right? And I think sometimes there's benefits to doing that, right? I think where there's provenance or authenticity, et cetera, there's reasons that even just doing that is beneficial. But I think looking at it as a different type of canvas with different ways to explore or to communicate is really fascinating. It's also different talking to people that are an artist like yourself versus some of the art on Bitcoin that's more collection oriented, or I'm sorry, community oriented, PFP style, whatever. And I always give, I think, a lot, or I respect the artists that are not doing the community angle. Not that it's bad at all. I love that too. But it's harder to get attention onto a project or getting attention onto art when there isn't that community element, right? It's easier to market when you have a whole legion of people that are physically presenting or showing themselves, right, as followers or part of your community. Is that something like in terms of getting the word out there about what you're doing and marketing the craft? Is that a challenge, or how do you approach that?
Well, I'd say it's the greatest challenge there is for any artist. There's wonderful work on the timeline every day where I would say it exceeds my capacities beyond recognition. Yeah? So there is a lot out there. Now the thing is, the an idea for me, and that's how I look at my work. It's a tool for communicating ideas and concepts. That's my approach to it. It's also perhaps why a lot of the work I'm doing might not be as decorative as some people would like to enjoy it in their living space or something. Some is, I would say so. But if you're more interested in this idea exchange, while you are recognizing that all of what we're doing, or most of it, is happening on social media. I mean, that's one of the great advantages of our entire ecosystem. It's this immediacy, a very short distance to the audience, and vice versa, also to the artist. I mean, you can basically just shoot anyone a DM or make a comment and get a conversation started. So the way I'm looking at it when it comes to getting the word out, there are several pillars to that for me. First of all, of course, it's always helpful to build out a network or a connection with other like-minded artists or people who are trying to sort of build themselves within the space and share ideas, talk approaches, strategies, even when it comes to how to build up sort of the pre-drop tension curve, if you like. On the other hand, of course, it's important that the idea is convincing. That's something you should not underestimate. Things can fail, and I think one of the things I found myself in, actually, when I was still debating if I wanted to go into this Ordinal's route, knowing that I would stylistically make quite a step into a different direction, not knowing how my audience I'd built up so far, my previous collectors, would react to it. That's also something where I think you should always be daring enough to not just continue doing what you did in the past, because that road leads to stagnation. And I think as artists, we're not only creating work, we are always in the process of creating ourselves as an artist, and there needs to be an evolutionary element to that. Everything else is just, it gets boring pretty quickly because the story gets told. And for me, it's when I look at particularly ordinals, it's more questions than answers. So I'm not near the end of telling anything of the sort. And then, of course, there's a third pillar. Of course, it is helpful if you create some kind of branding around your work. By that, I distinctively do not mean marketing. I think it's easier to market something if you have established a kind of brand look around yourself. But for me, a brand, or if you as an artist try to build a brand, you are adding that layer of communicating what you're doing, what you stand for, what you take responsibility for also within your work and what you're putting out there. You give sort of you open up the communication channel because you're identifiable as someone who can be approached. So these things I think are very important, particularly in the social media space. And of course, it is difficult to get noticed, if you like. It is attention you're seeking with what you're trying to put out there. If you just post, that this is my new artwork, this is where you can click the mint button, and And you just repeat doing that like every day, GM image, GM image. You can do that. It probably even gets you great, impressions if you do it very routinely and really feed into the algo there. But for me, when I look at this audience of people who, if you take the other perspective, I'm also part of their audience, respectively, and you're forming this little hub within this greater ecosystem. It's more about having a very personal and very immediate connection, and for that you need to be identifiable, and that is something I have tried to consider in building up this persona, which by the way is very close to how I am in my real life and everyday life as well. So that's rather unexciting there. Yeah, I think those would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's and what you said is so right, right? Is I think one of the beautiful things about the industry that we're in is that everybody is congregated in one place on social media and really on one platform, right? I don't think there's not the same traction on the Meta platforms or any of these others that you have here on X, right? But I think the downside to that is that it's super limiting, right? And you're almost forced into this funnel where you either have to play the engagement game, like you said, right, where it's almost cringy. You have to do the GM and buy into what works with the algorithm. And I think a lot of times artists have some of the strongest identities. It's almost like you have to separate from that to play this game, which almost sacrifices a little bit of that individuality, which I think is obviously limiting. Or at the same time, there's only so many ways to market on this platform, right? If you're in real life, there's a plethora of ways to get noticed or to stand out, right? Even if you're a traditional brand, there's different, marketing channels that you can tap into, and there really isn't on X, right? And do you then go into that influencer game where it's this pay to play, and it's a tough spot to be in, especially for a creative, right? So I think you're right. It is difficult. I feel like what you're doing is the long play, right? It's the one where there isn't an engagement hack to draw people to quality or to draw people to a craft. Rather, it's that continuity of showing up and trickle exposure, which then will have that kind of watershed moment, which I think a lot of people get, right? Especially when their product or when their art is strong or whatever it is. But specifically with what you're doing now with this collection, right? Because can you give me some details in terms of how that is rolling out, or when there's the reveals, or what the cadence is between now and that really getting out to the public?
Well, the collection is a 33-piece collection, and it's not only the ordinals. These ordinals come with the physical counterpart, which I can explain that a bit later. But that's something which is tremendously important for me personally within this context of this collection, but also the things I'm currently working on. So the 33 pieces, they actually look like this. So this is the refurbished floppy disk drive, which is functioning, by the way. And then these are, the different planes of my brain. And out of these 33 different pieces, actually all but one have sold at this point. So one is still available. And the way all of this rolled out was together with Vivid Gallery, for whom I'm now one of the collaborating artists. Vivid Gallery is I mean, I can't throw more good things at them and descriptions. It's been a tremendously wonderful experience with working with Gerard and Pierrot. It's a great community, and they actually have taken quite the risk there with me, because they're fully focused on generative art, and this was now the first purely conceptual collection they actually were willing to engage with and to integrate into their curational body of artists and different collections and works. And we were all very happy, of course, how well this collection was received. Just rather recently, I was able to display some of the physicals in Paris. And during NFT Paris, there was this little Ordinal village, a live protocol, and Vivid had their little representation there. and I was actually able to show some of my works there, the physicals. Actually, two pieces were sold on the spot. One of them to the Aeons community, so shout out to those guys over there doing great stuff. And yeah, that's sort of where things are at. And I must say, if you work with someone like Vivid Gallery, of course you are stepping away a bit from this fully self-marketed approach which you have, by which I mean they're just helping a lot to introduce new work to people who might actually take an interest in it, which cannot be overstated how meaningful and how helpful that is, facilitating conversations to happen, being introduced to people who just don't see you because they exist in a different algo bubble on X. So these sort of bubble breaking approaches where people actively show your work to other people is a very, 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 very helpful thing, while at the same time leaving you all the liberties with regards to what you want to create, how it's supposed to look. That has never been a conversation about, ooh, this is difficult to sell or something of the sort. So there they leave you complete liberty. But of course, as an artist, and particularly when you work on Bitcoin within the Ordinals realm, things do become quite technical. So tapping into their knowledge, Pierrot, the dev over there, how to make sure that the whole parent-child thing works out. In this case, we also use recursive inscriptions as a feature. That's really, really helpful. So the whole, I always like to say Vivid Gallery it's not really just a gallery, it's kind of a workshop. Like the comparison I like to make is if you create a bronze sculpture, you can sit down and make your little wax model, but you also need, the metal guys. You need someone who can put clay about it. You need someone who knows how to operate the oven to melt everything down. So it's really an act of co-creation when working with Vivid on an Ordinals collection, which is something I greatly enjoy because you learn so much. And of course, you have your artist's perspective, but it's really interesting what some people approach it more from the technical dev side of things. Actually bring to the table when it comes to these things, or the questions they ask, which you then have to deal with, which of course informs how the artwork gets shaped, because things come up you just didn't consider, didn't think about. So that's a very, very vibrant and dynamic way of creating, which I enjoy very much.
No, for sure. So staying, I want to get to the physical part, but before we even do that, right? So Vivid is number one is if I'm looking for your collection, I go to Vivid, which I'm on right now, right? But for people, I know there's only one left, but for people that are interested in part, do you do it directly through Vivid, or how does that exchange work?
Well, the exchange works via, it's a private sale, basically. I mean, things are listed on Gamma, they're listed on Magic Eden. I think two pieces are listed. One is, I think, at 0.33 and one at 1 Bitcoin, which I find very flattering. With that said, the easiest way to do it, you can either, on the website you've just opened up, if you click this little registry button there, you can enter your info. A much more direct way to do so is to go to the Vivid website or the Vivid X profile, and then there's a link to their Discord, and then just raise a ticket and express your interest there. There has been quite a lot of interest expressed. Not everyone who expresses interest probably ends up with the work, because if you have a kind of limited supply of things, when you don't really want to make this an instant flip of any sort, it is of course nice to know a bit about how people came to know about this, and so on and so forth. And so yeah, but the process I would recommend is to just jump into the Vivid Discord. Also ask other people in there about the collection, what their thoughts are. I'm in there quite frequently. I'm also always available to schedule a call. I had that with a couple of the collectors of this collection actually beforehand, to just have a conversation, go through any questions that might arise, and just talk. Yeah.
No, for sure. So no, I love it, right? And I just checked out Magic Eden while we're talking. That is, hey, that's beautiful, man. Someone selling for a Bitcoin. That's pretty awesome. So when somebody does purchase, you're saying they also get the physical, right? Which is a manual end of it. And when they receive that, right, on that disc are the scans that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, so on that disc, there is a laser engraving of that individual plane, one of the 33. There are 28 transverse planes and 5 sagittal planes. And on that disc, by the way, things are stored. So the metadata is actually stored on the magnetic disk, on the floppy disk, together with the image of the ordinal. So the JPEG, if you like, is on that floppy disk, on the physical floppy disk as well, and perhaps an Easter egg. I can't reveal that because I actually want people to plug in that disk and see what's on there. For me, it's something interesting because, of course, one of the aspects many artists are drawn to when it comes to ordinals is this aspect of permanence. For me, it's both fascinating and terrifying, to be very honest, because I mean, particularly in my profession, I primarily deal with the non-permanence of the human existence, if you like. It's kind of what doctors have to deal with. But for me, why I wanted to put that on the disc as well and kind of have a use this more archaic or older data archiving technology, which I'm now reusing or misusing, if you like, but as an actual canvas. The same way we're doing it with the Bitcoin blockchain. We have something that wasn't intended to be a canvas, but we're using it as a canvas by inscribing things on all of these sats. For me, it's something where kind of race begins. The magnetic strip or the little disk within the floppy disk, from what I read, estimates say it's like 10 to perhaps 20 or 15 years roundabout until the data on that magnetic strip gets corrupted due to age issues of the whole thing. So if you like, of course, we're all now at the point in the timeline where we have this belief, and I mean, there's rationale behind that and good arguments for it, that Bitcoin or ordinals are really a very good shot at achieving actual permanence. So for me, it's a bit of a race. Which one will outlive the other? The data on the floppy disk or the data on Bitcoin? They are pretty much the same, right? They're mirroring one another. But at the end of the day, do we really know? Do we really know that Bitcoin will outlive these physical floppy disks? The likelihood is very, very high, but of course, we're not a 100% certain. So it's a bit of a race. Which one will outlive the other? I have a clear preference, of course, and would know where to put my bet. But that's something I found very important because if you have a physical object which you hold in your hand and you can understand it by this tangible aspect, and then there's this digital, non-tangible thing, which is somehow tied to it, which you can only, wrap around not by your hand, but with your mind, with your willingness to understand it. For me, it's this transition of objecthood, if you like, yeah? The physical, which exists in two different planes simultaneously. And I think when it comes to digital art in general, having something which you have in a wallet and then every now and then you scroll through it on your computer screen, that works. That's okay. Everyone can do with the work whatever they want, of course. It belongs to them now, once it's been collected. But having something physical, by that you, of course, kind of force your way into the physical realm or area where your collectors reside. And by this collection, people are actually collecting a slice of the artist, very literally. Again, all these ideas that surround that. And for me, it's the greatest privilege out there that people actually allow this piece of me to both physically and mentally exist with them. Because
No, yeah.
if we look at this permanence aspect again, when you work more on the conceptual line of things, replicating your own thoughts in someone else's mind, thereby becoming on this thought area or level of your cognitive being, the same person in a way for a very, very brief moment. And repeating that process whenever someone else looks at it and rethinks the thoughts you had, that in a way is a form of permanence, if you like. Not of an object, but of an idea, which is also why it was so important to me to have the visual language or the concept behind this accessible. I'm not a great fan of conceptual art where you have to study for 6 years or read a PhD to roughly understand what all of this is about. So when you work with symbolism of any sort, you should always make sure that it's accessible. An idea is only as valuable as it is communicated and understood by the audience.
No, I mean, I agree. I think, you know, when you tie in that real tangible art as well, right? There's two different ways to look at that to an extent, right? Number one is, you know, when it has that physical presence, the actual inscription in a way can be far more, becomes, you know, that certificate of authenticity, but it also becomes a massive opportunity because of the capabilities of what you can communicate through that digital asset, right? So they can live separately or lean heavily into one or the other. And I think what you're doing is really, really interesting. And I guess one of my questions is, I have one of your other tabs here, and I'm not just saying this because you're on here. I love the work that you do in general. Not to even be more personal, I love the use of yellow. It's probably my favorite color. So I love that, but there's such a huge difference between some of your other art and what you're expressing in this most recent collection. And I'm sure that your mind is always on something new as well. Where do you see the direction, I guess, specifically on the digital side? What are you interested in exploring next, or what do you think is going to be explored next beyond maybe what people are doing right now?
Well, I think when you look at the Ordinal's artist space as a whole, we are at this very interesting moment where, you know, different genres are coming into existence. Basically, you already mentioned you have the more community-driven profile picture art. You have a lot of generative art, which is a natural marriage because it just fits so well with you know, fully on-chain mechanisms there. And then now you also have things like My Brain on Chain, which I personally, and I hope I'm not overstretching it, but I see that more in the tradition of something like Sense by Sovereign Art, a collection which is also very, very dear to my heart, which is really more going into the conceptual direction. Now, not to be misunderstood here, I believe that generative art can be highly conceptual. This is not something exclusive to non-generative art, if you like. But there are things popping up which are more in that direction where I like to work. And for me, let me just put it that way. I have secured the ordiobjects.art web domain, and that's kind of where I'm currently working on. Because as I mentioned previously, having this interconnection between the physical and the digital, and as you just mentioned, things can lean more into the one or the other. And I mean, for me, also the question arises: what is more valuable in a way? Is it the digital thing, which kind of represents the idea, or is it the physical sort of thing which went through a particular process to come into existence? And as you just showed some of these more painterly works, now having gone through this My Brain on-chain collection, I was approached by quite a few of my collectors, also looking into my previous works and asking, well, do you see a way to actually be able to bridge that onto fully on-chain work or ordinals? And I think, while I initially thought I could never, now probably at a point where I'm saying I think I can. And of course, coming with probably quite hefty inscription costs or something. But again, if it works concept-wise for me, and now, also having more freedom to move, because basically, I have a job which pays my bill. So I'm in a very, very privileged position to use pretty much all of the revenues I generate from sales of my art to, pamp up my workshop, get new machinery, pay inscription costs, all of these things. Because again, art on Bitcoin is an expensive endeavor. But what I'm currently working on is sort of re-collaborating with a group, or how you call it, a workshop I had already worked with in the past, which is kind of using a quite sophisticated process to create robot paintings of the more painterly digital art I had created. And it's a really pretty interesting process, because they kind of make a depth map of your images, and you go through that back and forth, really looking at each and every little brush stroke which you made, and they kind of feed all of that into an algorithm, and they get your colors selected and all of that, and you reproduce something via a really very complicated mechanism. And for me going forward, that's, for example, the question I very much like to ask. If you have something which went through an insanely, almost absurdly complicated process to come into physical existence, and you put in all of that effort to have something that looks as if someone had painted it using all tons of artificial means, and then you have this digital artwork, which again is the concept of it, the initial idea, the blueprint of everything that followed, which carries more value? Is it the process that counts? Is it the technical finesse, which is, which gets the highest amount of value attribution? Or is it really the idea, the concept, which kind of dominates it all? And I don't have an answer to that. And I think you could, as you mentioned, argue into both ways. But I think in this, more and more digital era, where now also art becomes tokenized in a way, I find that a very important question to ask, because basically what is happening here is that we are, of course, entering into a new realm where art can be displayed or inscribed, and has this permanence to it and all of that. But by doing so, you are, of course, also somehow ripping something away from the more traditional forms of enjoying and seeing and engaging with art, which is the physical piece, at least still for my generation. It might be a very different thing when my kids grow up. But this kind of tension between these two, which I find not very easy to describe or really nominate in terms of value proposition between these, that's something I'm very, very interested in, because I'm always interested in things to which I don't have a clear answer.
Well, I have a question that might be super basic, but I'm following along with what you're saying, and I'm when you talk about the I think you called it like the robot painted, right, or even just some sort of quote unquote artificial, for lack of a better word, process, right? Do you look at that as the way to replicate the art, or is that the medium or the interesting component in and of itself? Because I could see it like that's pretty fascinating to me, even to own something that is done that way, if it hasn't been done many times before, is beautiful because of that process. Or do you look at that as a means to replicate an individual art piece?
I don't know.
Yeah, because it's really interesting, especially because it's new. It's new, right? It's like it's new, and that sort of innovation or ingenuity is fascinating to me in and of itself, right? Even if that were the focus to an extent. But it also, the byproduct is that you would probably be able to replicate or create more of an initial idea. I didn't know which you liked or didn't like, because I don't know which one I like or don't like.
That's it's not a basic question at all, by the way.
Okay, good. I didn't want to be like, hey, moron, like
no.
Keep your eye on the ball here, but
no, you've really put the finger into the wound there. So this is where I am really on the fences, and again, I don't want to give away too much at this point, but this being torn between, well, how do you actually think about this, which probably is also subject to change. You might have an opinion about that one day and then it changes over time. But this kind of tension between the two, precisely the question you have just asked, will be pretty much at the center of what I'm currently preparing. It's a small collection. It's not something, huge drop coming, listed on Magic Eden tomorrow or something of the sort. It's more, more small, more intimate in a way, perhaps also. But the question you've asked is placed pretty much at the center of it.
Yeah, because I think, and again, I up front, and you can obviously tell, is my level of understanding or sophistication in art as a whole is obviously nowhere near as developed as you, right? However, I look at with any product, let's say there's a draw, right? And often in art, the draw is to the art piece itself. But I think in your case, just my opinion, or the way that I feel is I'm very drawn to the artist or to the creator, and that process then becomes very valuable, right? Where I'm almost just as interested to see what you're doing or what you're doing next, because that is going to be the interesting piece. I like the outcome already, but I'm saying following the wavelength is part of that journey. So to me, that's why I was asking. I think it's very interesting, and I think it also then, I guess, and this, I know that on the inscription side or the development side is maybe not what you do entirely, right? But I feel like the medium right now, or the capabilities right now, are guided or dictated by what is able to be inscribed, right? And that's a limitation of my understanding too. But I feel like testing the boundaries of what's able to be inscribed, not just size and mega whatever, but more of like what kind of experience. I guess a reference that I have is, you saw what portraits did, right? Are you familiar with portraits?
Yes.
And like that was something I didn't know that you could do, right? I like the art, but the ability to interact with it is really, really interesting, right? And I think, that maybe taken further is like immersion into that art is really interesting. I don't know what the capabilities are right now, but I think that's probably up to the artist to push that boundary. And I don't know what direction that goes.
I think history tends to perhaps not repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that's the saying, right?
Amen. I say it too much. I overuse it. So yes.
What I actually see now, and by the way, there's incredible things out there. If you look at inflatables by Shaderism, for example, whoa, what's going on? I actually was able to talk to him during NFT Paris. And, it was this very, very humbling moment when you realize, all right, there is a whole other, Olympus kind of thing when it comes to the technical side of these kind of things. I kind of compare the Ordinal space at its current point in the timeline. There are similarities with this AI movement when it kind of popped up. In terms of that, at the beginning of that, where I was kind of present, things were tremendously tech-driven. What is possible? What can be shown? Oh, this is an AI animated piece, and that's kind of its primary value proposition, because it used a new tool for the first time and was the first work. First is of meaning in a ecosystem where things are based on collectibles. It's always nice. I wish I'd still have my 1998 Pokemon sets or something. So there is something to that, but for me, first in itself is maybe of value at a particular point in the timeline. It may also continue to be so for many people. It's not for me, honestly speaking. First, but not being also, adding something of true value or conceptual depth is not something that can stand for itself, at least not for me. But that's, again, a very personal take, and fully understand when people would argue just into a very different direction. But I remember in the AI art space, being first or just pushing the technical tools to their limits, that was appreciated. That was what people took great interest in. That was something where artists had a lot of joy working with. And I think right now on Ordinals, we are a bit similar in terms of well, what's possible on ordinals? I mean, this has not yet been defined, at least not to the full extent. I'm not sure if it will ever be completely defined, because people always come up with new ideas. But I think in the mid to long run, especially if you consider that you're working with an eternal medium, so the works I'm creating today are something my grandchildren's grandchildren will still be able to access if everything works out. And I don't know if some of the things that by then will have become so normalized. Well, of course, you put things or digital art onto some kind of system that has permanence to it. That will probably be something that will be normalized. In what final form, whatever that may look like, I wouldn't mind if it's ordinals. It might be something entirely different. If you span the story arc across multiple generations and hundreds of years to come. So yeah, I think exploring what's possible right now is basically the seed for these different genres which we will now see appear, be it stylistically, be it conceptually, be it in terms of actual art movements being started on Bitcoin as we speak. But that's something which is really happening right now. And that's something why I am so drawn to this entire sub-ecosystem, if you like, because you as an artist, you are on that kind of playing ground. This kind of meteorite just dropped in front of your feet. And now artists are standing around it with the little sticks poking at it, seeing what it can do. And that's an important part of the timeline and of how ordinals might evolve. And it's a necessary step even to go through. But I think in retrospect, it might lose a bit of its importance because you will ultimately end up with a replication of things or then different things within that one branch, which was of course started at that point. But I think what for us is more important is that you create work not only to feel good about it being permanent, but to bear in mind that people you yourself will not be able to explain it to will still understand it. I think that's, for me at least, much more important than the technical finesses of what's possible.
No, I follow you completely. And as we're talking, this is personal to me and maybe anecdotal, but I'm trying to figure out. I like digital art. I like art in general, right? But there's something about you that I'm drawn to, right? And it's not the art itself. And I guess what I mean is this, right? With a lot of artists, if you follow them or whatever, more or less what that next outcome or piece is going to be, right? Because you like the way that you like their style, or you like the way that they design things, or the way that they express. What's super interesting, I think maybe this is it, as I'm writing down notes here, is the intimacy of, being in your brain is quite literally what this collection was, right? That's unique. It's not, it's you're allowing literal access into the artist's brain, right? So the product itself, or the art itself, almost becomes secondary to being in that brain, right? So however that's going to be expressed next is interesting, because now I feel like I have an inside peek, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a painting or it's digital or whatever, it's more the expression that becomes the focus to an extent. And, I think, in terms of what can be inscribed, it can be approached from like a technical angle where there's a technical answer, right? Where, it might be the size or whatever that can at this moment actually be inscribed. But I think it's more of coming from maybe, the standpoint of you as the artist, et cetera, is what is able to be expressed, right? That might not always be the actual technical capability. It's the creative ability of what can be inscribed, right? And topically, again, it's maybe interaction or immersion. I don't know. I think that's what's really cool about the artists that are in here now, is they're going to be pushing those boundaries. And it might not be a technical answer as to what can be inscribed, but what kind of experience for the viewer can be inscribed. And I don't know. That's why I was interested in saying, like, what are you exploring next? Because it's not so much to me about what is able to be, but what can be. And I don't know. I'm very interested in that.
Well, first of all, I'm very likely going to steal that phrase from you. It's about what can be expressed. It's how do you call that? Bullseye.
I liked it. I don't even know if I meant to say it that way, but as I said it, I was like, damn, that sounds pretty good. I might use that again.
But at least again, there is no one definition of art or good art even. It's very different for very different people. And I think what you are basically expressing or describing there is, well, my reply would be, welcome to conceptual art. Because there, again, you have a different order of things. If you look at conceptual art, it starts with the idea. That's what's placed at the very center, at the top, and around everything. But it's really the visual representation of that concept. It comes second. There's a very clear hierarchy between these two things. Now, that's not an invitation to simply create something awful and say, yeah, but the idea was great. So not every idea is good conceptual art. Yeah, but that has to be stated very, very clearly. At least that's my personal opinion. And then you have things which are not coming sort of from the idea side first, and then you find a visual mode to kind of fill that idea or make it visual. If you look at abstraction, on the other hand, and I make this distinction between the two, you're more taking something and then working based on that, dysmorphing it or changing it, and then kind of by going through this kind of reductive process, if you want to go more minimalist or whatever you apply to it, by that you kind of add meaning to it. Or it gets a meaning at the end of the day, but the meaning stems from the work and not the work from the meaning. At least that's how I like to look at sort of two different approaches that both end up creating art. It's just a question of hierarchy, of priority, of what's more important to you as an artist, and where you as the viewer experience more that actually resonates with you, or invades your thoughts, maybe even changes the way you think or look at things. And that's sort of when I look at things I want to create in the future now. For me, that is very important in terms of, I don't just want my art to be something passive, which is there and you look at it and you think something about it. What I'm interested in currently with the things I'm exploring and I'm starting to apply for drafting, first prototypes, it's really about how can we get more actual, even physical interaction into it. That you become an active participant of the work, you connect yourself to it. And that can be a pretty brutal act to do, because some of the things you ultimately might have to confront yourself with might not necessarily be very pleasant. They might be important though. And so with the works I'm currently creating, that is an aspect I really want to put an emphasis on. Because as with my brain on chain, I mean, the act of owning a slice of the artist, I mean, you can look at that. That's a pretty drastic thing to do from the audience side. So that's something where you say, well, you basically, as an artist, you're always sharing your ideas, but you're also turning your ideas into something consumable, if you like. And there is that aspect to it. You have this, very interesting triangular relation between the work, the artist, and then the audience. And the audience can be a seeing audience, an understanding audience. It can be a consuming audience. It can have all three of those attributes. But everyone has those sorted in a bit of a different order for themselves. And kind of going through that process or that confrontation as a collector, where am I standing on that side of things? How did I end up with this? And just thinking about that's something I want to just, push into people's faces, if you like, or where I think it's important to confront them, because I think if you collect art within this ecosystem, you can do so following financial considerations or thinking about, having a valuable asset which might rise in value, that's perfectly fine. That's also, by the way, why I have no issue at all with the more, profile picture kind of works out there. Those are the things that keep the lights on in this entire space, as Peng One always says, someone who I greatly admire for his very, deep insights into how all of this works and operates. But that's just not where I'm at personally with the things I create. So being a bit more daring in terms of also daring to confront people with some of the underlying mechanisms within the space, how they themselves approach it, how they act. One of the things, if you have something as decentralized as our ecosystem is, you are an active participant. You're not just an observer. By just being there, you're already part of something which by nature is highly political in a way, and comes with agency. And agency comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with the urgent need to pause every now and then for some introspection, just to see where, how you are actually maneuvering all of this, how you yourself, even if you have no art background at all, are now confronted with something that forces you to look both at the work, but ultimately also more into the inner depth of your own inner landscape.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's interesting because I think it's almost implied to people that are maybe more new to this, right? Is that when, let's say that there is an art piece and you get the the digital inscription, but it also comes with a physical, right? There's almost an implication that they are similar or the same, right? Where the art is almost in making sure that they're identical to an extent, right? But with conceptual art, it's almost as though they don't need to have that connection necessarily, right? Because when you're looking at art in real life and it's in front of you, you have the viewing of it, and then you have the thinking that comes along with it, right? Which is that art form. However, when there is that digital element, you're able to experience it or communicate that message in a different way that's symbiotic, right? It's almost as though they don't have to be the same as one another, right? They can be complementary and slightly different, which is really, really fascinating. And I think maybe to an extent that's what you're talking about, right? Or
they can. There are different ways to arrange this interplay between the two. And I would never argue for this is how you have to do it, because that's where the magic happens, right? By not being very clear about these sort of things. Because if you dictate everything, then you kill thinking, right?
Yep.
So yeah, it's not a necessity. I would fully support that. It at the end of the day depends. What I wanted really not to do or try to prevent was to have a digital artwork and then there's just a print or a physical representation of it.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that would be something I would not feel very excited about. So, as I mentioned, having this, this is data archiving technology, which is prone to decay. This is data archiving technology, which probably doesn't. Go signalers now. Which one will outlive the other? How do they interrelate? The physical has to be tied to the digital on the conceptual level in order for me to be considered interesting. But again, that's just me.
Yep.
that's just a personal interest, and of course, I follow my personal interests in the creative process here.
Yeah, no, I never thought about it until the conversation. So it's kind of made my mind explode a little bit, but it's really, really fascinating. I think, especially with this collection right now, it's exactly what we're talking about, which is just these two different takes on the same thing that makes you think far differently. I love it. I wish it wasn't a Bitcoin. Because I'd be all over it. I don't know if I can break the bank on this. It'd be a hard conversation with my wife, but I think it's
one
beautiful,
piece
man.
that hasn't found a collector yet is not a Bitcoin. I can assure you that.
Okay. No, I love it, and I think in that specifically on Bitcoin, that narrative is still fresh and new, right? Art on Bitcoin is something I heard about several months ago for the first time, and it takes strong visions and personalities like yourselves to really push that. So I'm appreciative for it, and even this conversation. But Matt, I've been hijacking the whole thing. I can see you wanted to say something there. I apologize for taking up the
no,
first
I've
half.
just enjoyed listening. It's obvious with artists coming from the traditional art world and being skilled there, moving into the digital world, seeing that the world is going digital. It's obvious that the physical art is cherished, right? And it still is cherished by everybody. But you've got this digital way of showing your art. And so I love how Doc has um, wanted to tie those together and have that be a relationship with each other. Otherwise, because somebody can keep the physical art and then send the digital piece to somebody else that wants it, which is cool too. But if it has a relationship with each other, then it's far more interesting. And how people figure that out and do that in the best way, especially for an artist, will really, because I think that it could benefit each other, right? It could, as in at the beginning, where what goes into the physical art piece, like all the complexity and or the way that it's created, can be shown in the digital piece through whatever algorithm showing each brush stroke, showing each how it was made, and that's the creative piece. And also at the end it shows the completed piece too, so you've got the digital piece and then the physical piece. But the digital piece shows more of what went into it and more of the story involved, and what was the thought behind the art in general. But sometimes artists don't really want that. Sometimes artists want just to show the final piece of the physical art and have the customer, the person that loves the art, to get the feeling themselves of how they feel about that final piece, right? And so it's a very interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think and Doc, I'm not going to hold you up all night.
Yeah,
I know it's late over there, but I think what's interesting too is, I think people look at the inability to display in a traditional sense as a limitation of digital art, right? What you buy, somebody who's buying art wants to put it up in their home. A lot of people probably, as want to flex that they have that art. That's part of the value of it, is the display, right? And it's slightly limiting on the digital art side, but in a way that almost makes that medium more personal, right? Because it's not about showing it to other people or that flex component or even what other people think, because you are consuming it as an individual more privately, right? And I know there's ways to display and all those things, but it makes it it almost makes it more personal when it's digital, when I think traditional thinking would say the opposite. I don't know. I think it's an interesting way of looking at it.
No, I think you're onto something there. Personally, certainly. And I mean, you only have that many walls, right? Everyone only has that many walls. So there's another limitation to that. I do believe, I mean, the act of purchasing a digital artwork, because in that moment it resonated with you very deeply, or you just liked the overall idea of it, or just initiated something in you, or walked you down a different path of thought you hadn't walked down before. Of course, it's very personal, and I think what you just described is the only reason why digital art is still a thing. People, with all the challenges of the market and all of that, but of course, there is meaning to it. And I mentioned previously that for something like My Brain on Chain, I didn't really want to have that simply in some wallet and not also displayed. But that's basically by nature of that particular collection, because it is something where, of course, if you share yourself, I mean, I'm basically putting my medical records out there. So
Yeah.
that's something where I just wanted to make sure that it's not just hidden away. That might be, a bit of hubris there, or something which was just meaningful to me, because again, I wanted to assure that those who actually engage with it and want to collect it, that they engage with it ideally or perhaps even on a daily basis, thinking about these connections we just talked about. And that's again where I personally can't stress it enough, why it is so important to me that the physical is linked to the digital on the concept level. That there should be a tie, at least for my work. I consider that very, very important. They're not that separable. But of course you could, if you look at it more as this is the digital token of ownership and this is the artwork, that also works perfectly fine. Uh, if that's how you want to communicate it.
I've been saying this for a long time. I think we even need to
So,
go.
I'm getting some feedback from something. No, I think that in of itself, thinking about the interplay, like you said, is fascinating, right? Whether that be for art or really any function on the blockchain, in terms of value, right? Is they don't need to be replicas. If it's an RWA, they can be complementary. I think it's fascinating, and I think the whole conversation was, Doc, something that I enjoyed immensely, and hopefully something that maybe we can do again, because kind of broaden my horizons quite a bit, and I'll be chewing on this for the rest of the night. So I greatly appreciate you coming on. I love what you do, and again, the conversation was stimulating to say the least. So I appreciate it greatly, my man.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for having me and for taking so much interest in what I'm trying to work on.
No, absolutely, man. And I think I just started to pull on the string, so I'm gonna be doing that some more. And again, we'd love to have you back on sometime, and absolutely support everything that you're doing. So I appreciate it, and let's do it again sometime.
Anytime. Be a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Doc.
Right on. Beautiful. And yeah, we'll be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. same time, and back at it. And wish everybody a good night. And we'll talk real soon. Doc, have a great night. I know it's getting late over there, so appreciate you again.
Have a good one. Thank you very much
you
for having
too.
me.
Amen. See you guys.